Thanks everybody for joining. Welcome. This is a webinar on Innovation's Holy Grail, measuring what matters for success. One of the funny things about innovation, and I think my career as an innovator, is this area of KPIs and measures has always been a bit of a struggle for many of us. And I include myself back when I was a corporate innovator, trying to ensure that I had the right measures, the right combination of KPIs that leadership understood that I felt were meaningful. And so we're going to have a really fun session, I think, today. It's going to be a little bit interactive, so prepare yourself for that. We have a nice, fun process to maybe start the discussion going in a moment around what kind of innovation measures are meaningful, can work, that also work for us as innovators, not just for leadership as well, because I understand that these things are crucial. Brief introduction about myself. I'm Colin Nelson. I'm Chief Innovation Consultant here at Hype. I've been a former corporate innovator. What we now call corporate entrepreneur was my role for many years. And then for the last sort of 15 to 20 years, I've been working as a consultant into the innovation industry, supporting chief innovation officers and leadership to improve innovation performance. And it's been a very diverse work portfolio. I've supported the likes of NASA to Harley Davidson to the United Nations to big banks and to law firms. So it's very, very diverse. But what I see is every organization is trying to improve innovation performance. But of course, everybody does things in a little bit of a different way. Now, what's been interesting this year is we've seen the new standard for innovation management systems, ISO 56001, released back in September. And that includes some, let's say, some indications about measures and KPIs. Now, it doesn't tell you exactly what you should be measuring and reporting on, but it gives you some ideas to think about and things that we might potentially use to create that common language between leadership and corporate innovators. So today we're going to dig into this topic and we're going to start sharing some examples, and I'm going to share with you my perspective on what I think good practices are for measures and KPIs and where I see perhaps the industry trending, because I see what works and I see what doesn't work, and I'm starting to see certain things emerging in terms of these areas for measuring innovation. Now, just a quick point on this. If you want to ask any questions as we go, please feel free to put them into the chat. We have the Q&A now. The Q&A is always working.
That
Put
is
it into the
working.
chat if you wish. That's great. Feel free. I'm going to hand over to Rita, though, for a few house rules before we really get started. So hand back to Rita, and she'll just explain a little bit about how this session is going to work, and a little surprise offer towards the end.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're happy you're joining us today. Just a few things that we want to ask of you. Please keep your mic on mute during the session. If you have any comments, feedbacks, or question, please put it in the chat. It should be working right now. And if possible, turn your camera on. We want this to be an interactive session. Exactly. Use the chat to engage with us. And please stay till the end because we have a free offer from Colin that is very interesting. So make sure not to miss it. On to you, Colin.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rita. So let's get it started. I'm going to start off with a story. And this is a story from part of my career about 15 years ago. It's highly related to this area of measures and KPIs when it comes to innovation management. I was working with a publishing company. And in publishing, this was back in 2008, 2007, that kind of period. And this particular publishing company in 2006 had realized that obviously the usage of paper-based methods as a form of communication were on the decline. And they wanted to innovate, and they wanted to think about new digital capabilities they could bring to the market. And so they did what I would love many organizations to do, which was establish a new innovation program to really focus on new capabilities, going beyond the incremental innovation into the strategic and more disruptive space. And over years, what they started to do was to formulate new concepts that they were going to take to market. Now, they appointed a very good, very experienced chief innovation officer, somebody who'd done this in other organizations, a very, very credible person. They gave him a substantial budget, and they started to build a team. They did everything that you would want to do in a progressive, modern innovation management system. Now, what was interesting is they gave this individual a 3-year window because they knew innovation takes time. It's going to take us a little while to get used to these new concepts, to introduce these new things to the market. So they started to establish a 3-year window for these new concepts to emerge. They started in 2006, and some of you may remember in 2008 we had the credit crunch. Now, that sort of created a huge amount of consternation within the organization. As the head of finance approached the head of innovation and said, "Tell me what value you've delivered." To which the response was, well, nothing yet. We've got a 3-year window. The results actually come in 2009. You have to be a bit more patient. We're trying to change our business. However, at that point in time, innovation management wasn't really respected as a discipline in that industry. Unfortunately, due to cost cutting that they made, they cut the whole innovation team. They hadn't demonstrated the value of their existence because they were given this 3-year window. Innovation takes time. And it really struck with me just how important it is to demonstrate the value that we're delivering over time, no matter what we're working on. Because when things change within the business, they tend to ripple through and change for the innovators themselves. And if we only focus on the strategic, the disruptive innovation, which frankly is often our passion, is to try and make bigger changes, it's a little risky because we need to be able to demonstrate at any point in time that we're delivering value for the business. Demonstrating what value we're creating to leadership, even if it's incremental, is crucial to ensure that everyone continues to have confidence in what we do. And in many cases now, what I see organizations do is they start with the incremental innovation, they measure that rigorously, and they start to layer on the strategic and more disruptive workflows on top of that afterwards. But they keep that incremental stuff flowing to make sure that they're constantly demonstrating how they're adding value. Now, some of us only work in strategic or more disruptive innovation areas, but it's something to ponder on is how do we demonstrate the value of our existence? Now, as innovators yourselves, I'm sure over time you have been given all kinds of different measures. And I always smile when I ask people, what kind of measures have you been reported? Was there anything that was a little ridiculous, a little bit strange, a little bit unusual, things that frankly you didn't agree with? And so we're going to have a little session now where we're going to go into a little something we call hype boards, which is a little tool that we can share your observations on ridiculous measures that you've been asked to report. So you'll see there in the slide, we've got a URL you can follow. I'm going to put that into the chat as well for you. Just click on that. You should be able to access it straight away without anything else, without registering. And you'll start to see that there's some options to submit your own suggestions. So I'm going to put this up on the
I
screen
can
as
put it
well.
in the chat so everyone can just press on the link.
Fantastic. And I'm going to share with you my screen as well. So you should be able to see in very shortly what everyone else is seeing. On the submission process, you'll see a little form. There's a drop-down box there which says what to submit. And what I'm asking you to do is if you click on that add new, you'll see a little option for submitting a title. Don't worry about the description. And the category, the little drop down boxes, pick that top one. What's the most ridiculous innovation measure you've been asked to report? Anything goes here. I'm very fascinated in seeing what kind of things that you've seen. Feel free to submit them. You can see there's a couple of I've already started to put in with things like how many people will participate in an innovation challenge. Is that a meaningful, useful measure to us? I'm not sure. What about how many ideas have you got? Is that a useful measure? Do we want lots of ideas, or we just want do we just want the best stuff? Try and have a think about what it is that you would like to capture. So feel free. I'm going to give you a few minutes now to start submitting your suggestions about what were these ridiculous or strange or unusual measures for innovation that you've seen. Feel free to start putting them in and we'll have a look at what those are. All right, return on investment. Yep, that sounds like a pretty common one. How many innovations will be in the market in 6 months? Yeah, very good. How many people participated internationally? Okay, profit after 3 years after R&D. Yeah, projected financial impact. When's the break-even point? Really good suggestions. Any others out there? Yeah, budget burned. What's the path to revenue? Like that. What we can see here, of course, is a real diversity of different things that we've been asked to capture. And what that tells us is there's not a real lack of consistency from leadership in terms of what is it important that we should actually measure. And this is kind of interesting, right? So why, given the fact innovation management is not a new concept, and we've been working this field for such a long time, we have such a diversity of different things that we've been asked to measure over time. We're going to come back to this in a little bit, and we'll start talking about what you measure today rather than the more spurious or unusual things and what you believe is important to measure today. And again, I'll give you some examples about what I think is meaningful a little bit later as well. But what I think is fascinating is the fact we don't have a common way to measure innovation management performance. And that's a little bit concerning, actually, for many of us, because, of course, this is our career path. This is what we do for a living. And it's really important that we have an industry which is professional, that actually, yeah, I think is something that we can all, let's say, have some confidence in, something that we can believe in as a good career path, and we can have that linkage with leadership to show exactly, what we're trying to do. So let's move on. Hopefully you can all see my screen again and my slides. Maybe someone can just give me a thumbs up to say, yes, you can see them.
Yes,
And
we
then
can see them.
great, awesome. So let's move on and let's start talking a little bit more about these sort of measures. So sort of things that I've seen. How many people have been involved? How many ideas did we get? How much money have we made so far? Now, these are not necessarily ridiculous questions, but they might not necessarily align to where you want to be as an organization. They might not necessarily align to what you think is important as an innovator. And so there's this misalignment often between what leadership think is important and perhaps what we as corporate innovators think is important. There's not necessarily a common language there. And I'm hoping with this new emerging standards for innovation, this 56,000 suite of standards, we should get some improvements on that over time. But right now we are where we are. So let's look at this misalignment in a bit more detail. Now, as innovators, we know innovation takes time. And so sometimes the timeline isn't always predictable. We're not entirely sure exactly when we're going to be able to get there. It doesn't run necessarily like a normal project. Sometimes we're not necessarily clear about what direction leadership really wants me to take, and they might not know themselves. And so that can lead to disparate types of innovation work happening in different parts of the business. I think as innovators, we always want to focus on the things that make a real difference, and that means working on meaningful, impactful things. However, leadership look at things like results. When can I see those results? What expectations should I have for new things? There is a mismatch between how we do financial measures in an organization and the innovation journey. And I'm going to give you a book recommendation a little bit later to dig into that topic specifically. But if we think about what innovation looks like from a leader's perspective, when you talk to leadership, perhaps that are not necessarily familiar with the innovation world, what they say are things like this. I just want to know what we're working on. I want to have transparency on what the future of my business looks like. What are the new concepts that we're working on, the new innovation projects that we're working on? What is it we've got in the tent? And then what they also want to know is what's the expected impact or value that those things are going to have on us? When am I going to see the benefits? What they're thinking about is how do I protect the future of my organization? I know that if I continue to sell the things that I've always sold, then perhaps what I might see is a drop off in my revenues and my profits over time. Because if I continue to sell the same things to the same people, markets get more competitive, customer needs change. I'm going to have to continually add to those capabilities to ensure we remain profitable, we remain a growth orientated organization. I might want to see what the gaps are. So I can see we're working on these things over here and those things over there, but there's a gap here that maybe we need to fill. Do I actually have transparency over that? Because I'm not entirely sure that we're working on the right things. I'm sure many of us have been looked at other concepts that people are working on. Think this is a waste of time. That's never going to work. Or perhaps I don't believe the business is prepared to execute there. And then ultimately it comes down to, is this the best use of our money and our people? Have we got the right balance? Now, it becomes a little bit more complicated than that, of course, because not every organization is in the same position. I've got clients who are thriving, they're doing really well, and what they're focused on is exploiting what they already have to the best of their ability before they move on to that next big thing. But I've also got clients who are in adapt or die situations. If they don't change the fundamental nature of their business, they can see that there's a 5 or 10 year gap and they will go out of business or certainly decline significantly. If you think about the pulp and paper industry, we talked about publishing earlier, there was a point in time where they knew that the usage of paper is going to drop down to 40% of peak levels. Standing still isn't an option. So that compelling reason to act, or the innovation imperative, as I sometimes call it, affects what's the balance of our innovation portfolio. Should we be focusing on more radical things or more incremental things? Where is the business in terms of its journey? And what does that mean in terms of that balanced portfolio? I'll come back to balanced portfolio in a little bit later because it used to come up in textbooks, and we can talk about what the right balance is. Now, as an innovator, our journey is kind of interesting. We know that leadership ultimately care about money or impact. So perhaps if we're working in a hospital, we might be thinking about patient experience. We might be thinking about reducing infections. We're thinking about impact. In commercial organizations, we usually think about money. We're thinking about profit. We're thinking about revenue. We know that's what leadership care about. Now, to get there, we need to implement new things to deliver those results. So we know it's not useful to work on things that aren't going to get really implemented. We need to know that we're working on things the business believes in. To get there, what we need is a high quality portfolio of new things. So that means we know that not everything is successful, of course, but we need that diversity of activity to deliver an implementation. Maybe if I work in pharmaceuticals, I might have, say, 7 major new drugs that I'm looking at a time, and I hope that one of them comes off. My ratio of implementation is maybe 7 to 1. In consumer goods, it might be a little bit better than that, but not everything that we work on is successful. We have to accept that innovation is a portfolio of choices. Now, to deliver that high quality portfolio, we also need to think about what new ideas or new solutions do we need to create, and to get there, we need to be focusing on looking in the right places. Because if we're not focused on the areas that the business is prepared to execute, we're likely to go off track at some point. Now, this is our world as innovators. This is the journey that we are focused on, going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And all of these factors are important when it comes to delivering that money or that impact. So let's just think about each of these elements alone and think about what's important to help flow from one step to the next. So when it comes to looking for perhaps new hunting grounds, looking for the right places, we might need short, medium, long-term solutions. Perhaps we need to scan our environment, therefore. We need to think about what it's likely to impact us, what new regulations are coming down the path, what new trends are emerging, what new technologies are out there. We might need some dedicated capability to actually search and scan the organization to absorb those external signals. We might need to create a listening engine to absorb those external signals and make meaningful interpretations of them so we can set the company direction, or at least give the leadership a range of options that they can think about. So there's a listening and processing piece that is at the start of this, which is where we need to align to our overall strategy. Then, of course, there are the new ideas. So the short, medium, long-term focused activities, we may need to develop a culture of collaboration. We know that innovation comes from and creativity comes from people coming together. We might need experts on collective intelligence to understand how to harness those individuals and engage both not just inside the organization but outside, because sometimes the best ideas come from maybe from clients and customers, or maybe from suppliers or academic partners, not from the people that work for us. Different, diverse crowd. That will feed into our high quality portfolio. Now, to execute that, we might need to develop our skills. We might need to send people on training courses like design thinking, for example, or business model canvas. We might need to manage that portfolio through to implementation to make sure that we're working on the right things. We've got our innovation shelf of home for things that perhaps we like, but we're not working on right now. And then we've got a range of different innovations that we're working on in order to help deliver the impact we want in the business. We're going to need consistent metrics across the company. So money in, money out, time to implementation, our level of confidence in that forecast. Because unless we have those things, we're going to struggle to be able to compare apples with oranges and know which activities or combination of activities we're working on. So when we need to pivot or make a change, we can always consistently look at that portfolio of innovations. Implementation. We might need to engage customers at this point. We might need viable paths and groups for proof of concepts so that our early adopters get a chance to validate and improve and refine the things that we're doing before we go full bore and implement things at a full extent. We might need the data on the uptake and the validation of our approach so we can refine it through to eventually getting through to money and impact. And even at that point, the job of innovators isn't over, of course. We might need to refine the capability for the next new thing or the next market. There might be a version 2 that's coming down the path if there's something that's successful. Now, all of these things are important to us, and they should all be important to leaders, but the reality is we're not always measuring things consistently. Now, I mentioned a book recommendation. This is a good one. It's around innovation accounting. It says exactly what it is on the tin, a practical guide for measuring your innovation ecosystem's performance. And it looks at these different elements. Now, what you will see from taking a look at this is some really fascinating observations that might help with your conversation with leadership, because financial accounting doesn't really help align both the searching for new growth options as well as executing the existing business models. It's very much focused on the execution path. But the reality is the pace of change is so quick now that unless we protect the future of our organization, the role for innovators, we are going to struggle at a certain point in time. And history is littered with organizations that weren't looking further out than just what's in front of their nose. What we also see is financial accounting doesn't help measure the phases an asset passes through as it's converted into money. The value of something from an idea through to implementation, it changes. But how do we measure that? I think it's really interesting. Some organizations have done an IP audit, and they've looked at all of the different IP that they have in the organization and said, some of this stuff we're never going to commercialize. So actually, we're going to license it out or we're going to sell it on. It's pointless sitting on a shelf. Let's try and convert it into money. The final point I want to make here is that financial accounting really doesn't effectively cover the innovation process and the commercial imperative, that innovation imperative I talked about before. Is how urgently do we need to change that portfolio of things that we do in order to protect the future of our business? So, as I said, take a read of this. It will help, I think, start to introduce this language that I think is very helpful when it comes to talking to leadership about what they should measure. So, next question is, what do you measure today? So we're going to go back to Hypeboards, take a look at that link again, and we're going to take a look at, instead, when you make the submission, this time I want you to hit the drop down box which says, what do you measure today? Let me just share my screen again so you can see the boards. And there we go. So you should be able to see that. So this time we're going to hit the different drop down box. That's what do you measure today, and those ones are going to pop up in blue, so we'll be able to see how the differentiation between the crazy ones perhaps and perhaps the things that you think are reasonable or things that you're measuring today. And then we're going to dig into some of these in a bit more detail. So feel free to take a couple of minutes, start to share those measures that you currently measure today. So I already see we've got a few here. How many people participate internationally? That's an interesting one, isn't it? How many people are coming from different places or locations? Expected value of the innovation pipeline. I like that one a lot, especially if we have a confidence measure or something that we can look at in terms of our level of risk associated with that. If you think about sales pipeline, when you're predicting whether a sale is going to happen, you usually have a confidence level, percentage likelihood that's going to happen. Innovation is no different, really. We have a chance of more radical innovation. Maybe think it's 10%, 20% chance of meeting our forecasts, but maybe in our incremental space, it's like 80% of chance that maybe we implement it because we know it really well. Now, the value of the incremental stuff may be less significant, but the chance and likelihood is more likely. So we should expect to have more risky or more likely things to happen. What else do we measure here? So we've got a number of ideas submitted. The revenue forecast over 10 years. Yep, good one. Time to market makes sense. Number of implemented ideas. That's an interesting one. How many ideas have we implemented? Does that matter more than the overall impact of those ideas that we've implemented? Maybe in continuous improvement, this is actually a useful measure. If we're innovating the business model, maybe in the innovation world, perhaps a little bit less so. Input budget into percentage of sales, interesting. Yeah. So what percentage is actually coming in from our innovation program? How many ideas come in from which department? Yes, I've seen that one many times. New products as a percent of total sales. So have we got that ongoing flow of new things that are coming into our sales portfolio that show that we are continually reinventing ourselves? Now, of course, the percentage of that is variable according to your industry. How many years rejected? Interesting. Net present value. Yeah, I knew someone was going to put that up in case of the project before and after. Fantastic. Yeah, well, there's great suggestions, and thank you for sharing them. I hope that's been interesting for you to see what other people typically share as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to switch back over to my slides, and let's start digging into maybe some insights from the world of the new standard for innovation management from ISO. But also, I want to talk a little bit about some of our experience about what actually works. So hopefully you can all see my screen. Again, please do shout if you can't. So we talked about what people measure today. There are some examples. These are things that we have seen both from ISO 56002, which was published back in 2019 on performance evaluation. For those of you not familiar with ISO, it's the International Standards Group. Over the last few years, there have been an increasing number of standards associated with innovation. That's under the 56,000 suite. 56001, which is the standard at which you could get a credit against, was released back in September. If that's of interest to you, then please do let me know. I'm more than happy to talk to you a little bit more about this set of standards and where it maybe makes sense. But embedded in there are some useful ideas. And what I've done is create a bit of a combination of useful ideas as well as some things that we see through our work that are things and measures. I'm going to work from the right hand side, and I'm going to go left. I'm just going to pick out a few. So things like quantifiable growth, so ROI, profit, market share. These are all things we would expect to see. Perhaps the new number of new partners. This is an increasingly common measure. How many new partnerships are we forming that potentially going to support the future of our business, or new collaborators? Sustainability impact. Sometimes the measures are not necessarily financial, but they might be carbon or might be reductions in water, for example. They might be cultural benefits that we see. We might have a measure around more diversity in the workplace. Innovation often is a transformation project as well. Cost savings, of course. We might be innovating for the purposes of changing the way we operate to reduce our spend. Let's move to the throughput measures. So how quickly can we test hypothesis? Is it in days, months, years? This is fascinating. How quickly can we get through that cycle of saying this has merit or no, it doesn't? This experimentation phase. And can we get better and quicker at doing those hypotheses? I think that's an interesting one for sure. Speed of a new capability acquisition. Again, some industries that's going to be really long. Pharmaceuticals, it might be 15 years before we see a new drug brought to market. In consumer goods, it might be maybe more like maybe 2-3 years. In media, it might be as little as weeks. So it depends on your industry, of course. And of course, the industries are getting more merged and they're getting more diverse in their nature. New tools and methods adopted. That's an interesting one. I was talking to a pharmaceutical company just recently, and they said they trained a quarter of their workforce on design thinking principles. I talked to a law firm, and they said they train every employee in new AI technology so they could look at how they could utilize those principles in order to increase efficiency in the day job. So sometimes measures on skills and capabilities eventually flow through to our ability to innovate. Then moving back into input, present value of ideas. We talked about that number of ideas we're generating, or generic submissions according to what it is we're trying to capture. All of these things make a bit of sense. So take a look at what I got to say. You might find it interesting. But these are the big themes that I'm sort of seeing here. So you've got the engagement and behavioral type measures. This is the number of people getting involved, the levels of collaboration, the number of different types of innovation conversation you're having, the breadth of the innovation topics that we see, and maybe training and competency building. I like that as a sort of set of categories. In terms of the portfolio or those throughput measures, forecast value over time, that came up in that in the idea shared earlier. Percentage risk across the portfolio. This is something not enough organizations do. So when we look at a new concept we're working on, let's also think about how confident are we that we can deliver that forecast. Now, maybe it's unfair to have the person that's working on it make that prediction. Maybe that biases the process. Have a think about maybe having an innovation committee that looks at maybe 10, 20, a portfolio of concepts and makes an independent assessment on that likelihood or that risk associated with that investment. That might be a better way of thinking about it. And I like to have that feeling of not everything is perfect, not everything's going to be successful, but if we have a chance to judge likelihood and we combine that with the level of impact we're expecting, it makes it much easier for us to make portfolio decisions on what we've got. A breakdown of our portfolio value by time horizon and what's going to impact us short term, medium term, and longer term. Ideally, we want to have a weighted view of that. Again, on the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit more about that idea of a balanced portfolio in a second. The percentage change since we last measured something. Are we getting better? Is the value of the portfolio increasing? Is it decreasing? Is the risk increasing or decreasing? These things are interesting. These things help tell us whether we've got the right balance in that portfolio, whether we're getting better at innovation, of course. And then finally, the portfolio measures, which I think we understand is primarily going to be financial or impact. Now, something to think about is our innovation ambition. So we talked earlier about how urgent is it for an organization to transform or change, because that's going to affect what type of energy we put into each of the different categories. So if we just focus on the existing offerings and the existing customers for those offerings, this is what we would consider to be incremental innovation. This essentially is improving the current products or services that we offer and the way that we perform. Now, there's a lot of value in that. And for some of you, that will be your primary focus and might be the only thing you ever focus on. Now, however, if your industry is perhaps developing or you're seeing an opportunity to maybe push into new areas, perhaps you see a situation where you can take an existing capability and apply it to a new market, or maybe take something new that you're developing and sell it to an existing customer. This is perhaps more into the strategic space. We're taking one step in the known environment and one step in the unknown environment. It's a little bit more adventurous, it's a little bit harder, might take a little bit longer, but potentially the impact in terms of revenue or value impact is going to be higher. And then finally, we have the more radical disruptive space. And in certain industries, this is necessary. If you can imagine you're in an industry where perhaps you're tied to the internal combustion engine, you're in the automotive industry, and we're seeing the automotive industry move towards electrification, you might think that actually we're in an adapt or die situation because more and more cars are electric and less will be burning fossil fuels. So that may well affect how adventurous you need to be. You might need more concepts in that more radical disruptive area where we're taking completely new things to potentially new customers as well. And we're really building upon our core competency. So, of course, what we want is that balance between all of these. And of course, don't forget the fact that we can innovate the way in which our organization operates, our core business. That might be considered continuous improvement by some of you. Your employees don't really make that distinction. They will typically share ideas and solutions to problems irrespective of where they are on the map. They might find it harder in those radical spaces and easier in continuous improvement, but essentially they're just helping out no matter where we are in that process. What we need to ensure, though, is we've got the right amount of energy in each of these zones. And so if we're comfortable and leadership are not prepared to invest or take risks, you might find yourself steered towards those incremental zones. However, if things are a little bit more challenging, or you see your market changing due to disruption or just natural trends that are emerging, you're going to be pushing up towards more of those upper right areas. And that balance may change over time. So it used to be more like a 70, 20, 10% ratio people would think about as being a good result. I think the pace of change now is so fast that's changing that answer, and it's being a bit more even across those three different time horizons. So how do we demonstrate our journey to leadership? We talked about what we know as that important five-step process, but we need to be able to express that to leadership in a way which makes sense to them. Now, we know that what they care about is the amount of money we're making or the amount of impact we're creating by a particular date. And to get that, we need to understand what we're going to be implementing and when. We need some kind of forecast that flows from our portfolio of capability. We've got 20 maybe new things with different magnitudes that are likely to be implemented over this particular time horizon. So if we've got good data, we can actually create a picture, especially weighted against our confidence level, to say this is what we're expecting in terms of impact or money over time based upon our best judgment. And this, again, if it's orientated towards an independent assessment on risk or likelihood, that's even better. So leadership can see, okay, we know what impact we're expecting from existing portfolio of things, and now we can see what impact we're expecting from our innovation team over time. And that combination of two, that gives us a forecast and tells us whether we're likely to hit our targets or not, or whether we might need to change that mix. And to flow into that portfolio, of course, we're going to need new ideas. We're going to need new concepts, solutions to problems, and many of which you're not going to implement. But that's just a consequence of doing business. We are going to have to start asking people and get them involved in terms of sharing ideas and new solutions. But where do we share them on? We share them against those areas of focus, those hunting grounds. That's where perhaps a listening engine would help us to be able to absorb those external signals, to be able to cluster things into meaningful areas, and then use that to set the direction of where we're going to do the idea generation, which eventually is going to flow into new concepts in our portfolio and implementation. And where we may end up is a dashboard that looks a little bit like this. And I'm going to work from right to left. So we express to our leaders what innovation outcomes we have, what money we've generated, or what time we've saved, or what speed we've increased. We might also express what soft benefits we've seen in terms of maybe cultural things or things around the environmental side of things or cultural elements. To feed into that, you'll notice here, an active portfolio and an innovation shelf. The active portfolio broken into different time horizons. I've got strategic, disruptive, incremental expressed here. The innovation shelf is the home for good things that we like, that we're choosing not to put time and money into right now. This is vital because not everything in our active portfolio will succeed. And when something fails, or we decide we're going to stop something because maybe the magnitude isn't enough, or maybe the technology doesn't work, what fills the gap? Is it something completely new, or is it something from the shelf that we like, which we hadn't had a chance to do before? So knowing what we have that we're working on, our active piece and our inactive piece, is vital because it ensures that we can pivot quickly when change happens. And to feed into those portfolios, of course, we're going to do some ideation work. We might train some people on different skills and techniques in order to support that. And there's a whole range of different techniques that are used typically for generating hunting grounds. That can be everything from environmental scanning to using methods like Rowan Gibson's 4 lenses, or looking at the 10 types of innovation, or even just listening to customers and clients really well. That can then feed into those hunting grounds, those innovation clusters, which will then steer us to where we might want to focus. So maybe as a dashboard, we might have as a situation where we can say, well, there's 20 different areas we can explore, and we're going to choose these two because we believe they're the most interesting for us over the next period of time. And therefore, we're going to ideate in those areas to generate portfolio in those areas, eventually to see implementation. I can see this as kind of the trend that I'm seeing. So the best of the best, they have some kind of innovation dashboard, which on one slide can represent to leadership. This is what you want. This is what we're delivering so far. And then this is our journey to get there. This is the steps that I'm taking in order to feed into that, to help educate them about what's important when it comes to innovation. So another couple of points. The word innovation is subjective. It means different things to different people. So clarifying exactly what we all mean is very helpful. Align expectations to make sure that we know what we mean. Now, for some organizations, that could be just something new applied locally that delivers impact. So it might not necessarily be a transformational idea. It could be something that's taken from another industry or another organization. For other organizations, it will have something that's a bit more specific. It may have a certain magnitude, and we may consider it to be innovation to only be something new that we've created here. But it's really crucial that we align on that terminology because it is a subjective word, and often leadership and us as corporate innovators, we have a different interpretation. Show and demonstrate what those indicators are on the journey, what we need to generate in order to get the results that we want. Try and increase leadership's expectations that if we don't start the process here, we're not going to get the outcomes there. So we might have this journey that we can represent through metrics or portfolio or dashboards to show we're heading in the right direction, or at least give them the information so we can pivot and adjust and have a meaningful conversation, because we have to show that full journey. Some transparency over what we're working on is genuinely going to help build belief in the process and engagement. You don't want to go down to the very specific details of individual concepts, but high level numbers in terms of when we're going to see results, what our expectation is, what our confidence level is in that process, what we need in order to feed into that, and trying to create a portfolio view rather than a sort of one egg in one basket scenario where it always feels like it's a yes or a no. Think about it as we have a limited amount of capacity, a limited amount of budget, and we need to make sure we're using that wisely across that portfolio. Now, if you're not sure where to start, I'd advise you to have a think about, what are people measuring today in my organization? Do a bit of an audit. What are we working on? What are you measuring? And try and get a sense of how close you are to perhaps this vision. And if you're not sure how to move the culture forward, just start by with one team or one division and create a kind of standard here. It's basic stuff. It's just, what are we working on? Money in, money out, time to implementation, confidence level in that forecast. And then I think what you'll see is that leadership will appreciate that, and they'll start to expect this from others, and it'll still be easier to get other divisions and other teams and other territories to start adopting it. Because what leaders want is they want transparency. They want to know what the impact's likely to be and when they're going to see that impact. So perhaps over time, we start to see this aggregation of measures where different teams all feed into something that's a common format into one macro dashboard so leadership can see, all right, now I understand what my expectations should be. I can also see where the gaps are. And let's have a meaningful conversation about whether we might need to pivot and change our direction. So just to summarize, before we get into Q&A and my little offer for everybody, a common language and a dashboard will help. Start somewhere and then start to iterate and build. You don't need to show every little piece of detail, but also we don't hide stuff. That portfolio view is really, really helpful. We're going to need to show that innovation journey. It's vital that leadership understand the steps we need to get to in order to deliver the outcomes that they need. And frankly, leaders might not ask for the right questions. We saw some of those measures earlier. We're going to have to show what makes sense. And as I said, if you're not sure, things like the ISO standards may well give you some indications, or come and ask me. I'm happy to explore that a little bit with you. Start small, show the results, and show how measuring innovation can work. Whatever you do in the first instance, it's not going to be 100% perfect. We are expecting to iterate that and change that and develop that over time as we learn. But hey, we've got to start somewhere. And if you're not sure, yes, the answer is innovate everything all of the time, because as I said, the pace of change is going to be vital. So yes, we think about the continuous improvement as well as the radical innovation. If we can improve these, this delivers value, impact to our businesses. And of course, that's what everybody wants at the end of the day. But trying to make sure we just got a common understanding of where we are and where we want to get to and what we might need to change our innovation work is absolutely crucial. So for those of you who stayed on right to the end here, there's a little QR code. If you scan that and submit on the little form, my offer to you is I'm going to randomly pick three organizations, three people for a free consultation with me, 30 minutes on any topic within the innovation landscape that you like. If you think that's valuable, scan your QR code, fill in the form, and then I will pick out at random three people to receive a free consultation. So that's your offer. And we have around 50 minutes left. And so time for questions. Rita, do we have anything already or are we waiting on the first few questions?
We have four questions.
Okay, go ahead then.
So we have a question from Peter Michel.
Mhm.
Michel, why will ISO 56008 tools and methods for measurement of innovation be deprecated next week and no new version will be released?
Yeah, great question. So there will be a new version. These things tend to happen about 3 year cycles. So what you should expect is that what you see today will likely to be in place for around 3 years, and then it will be refreshed and refined. What I would say is that in terms of the ISO, what it tends to do is give you lots of examples and principles. It's not saying you have to measure things in a particular way. It's saying these are the sorts of things you should be thinking about measuring. Now, whether organizations get accredited or not is a separate point. Even accreditation, it's really about documenting what you're doing. If you're trying to use ISO more as like a North Star, take inspiration from it. And so I wouldn't worry too much about it potentially changing. As I said, that those tends to be more of a 3 year cycle from a publication date to then a refresh. So it doesn't happen overnight. But yes, you should expect a refresh. But I don't think it's going to be dramatic. It will be my sense. It will be a refinement and an update rather than something that changes significantly. But great question.
So the next question would be, are these metrics and the process and workflows importantly all supported by the Hive platform?
Well, yes, they are. I mean, Hype has a variety of different software solutions. It's a toolkit that we have available to us. And yes, these sorts of things are all possible to be set up and measured and reported on in Hype. If you're a Hype client already, talk to your account manager or your customer success manager. They can be able to show you what it is you can measure. If you're not a Hype client, but you'd like to dig into that a little bit more, then feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to support you and try and understand what you're trying to do and see if we have something that fits.
And then we have one more question. How might you convince the board of management to invest into radical innovation projects rather than just pivoting around in either new products in existing markets and
Yeah.
exploring new markets with existing products?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it depends on the type of industry that you're working in, and how important it is to change and transform that industry. In some industries, it's easy because they can see the fact that due to rate of disruption or potential new trends. I use the example of perhaps an organization that's maybe operating in the internal combustion engine area. They know there's a cliff edge. So in those cases, it's much easier to convince leadership, hey, we need to do something that's a bit more adventurous than just operating incrementally. Most organizations are not quite, it's not quite that brutal. Now, what I try to put across is the fact what we need is that portfolio. So we need at least a little bit of our time focused on experimentation. Now, it might be 5 or 10%. I don't see organizations that are not in that radical issue, that have that radical issue, spend more than 10 or maybe 15% of that time. But the idea is to say we're going to spend a portion on incremental, we're going to spend a portion on strategic, but we should still reserve a little bit for experimentation and try and get them to buy into the principle because the results and the returns are significant. Now, the likelihood might be lower, but this is why this percentage of likelihood is really crucial, right? Because I might have an incremental solution which maybe saves me, I don't know, 100K, and it's 80% likely to happen. But I might have a radical solution that's worth 80 million, and then maybe maybe 10% to happen, but we'll do the maths, right? So if you think about it as a portfolio, if you have that data associated with both the incremental all the way through to the radical, and you can show that maybe spending a little bit of time in the radical is likely to be worth it in the end, maybe we're running with 5 concepts, right? But if one of them comes off, that's transformational for the business. So try and think about it from that perspective. Is if you've got that common data and you can report on that, you can display it in a dashboard, it gets a little bit easier to explain the fact, yes, we won't spend the bulk of our energy here, but we also need to spend a bit of our energy here, because the returns, if we're right, are a bit more significant. The other thing to think about when you're dealing with radical or more disruptive spaces, what is it that's specific to us that makes us able to take that opportunity, which often comes down to core competencies and assets. So let me give you an example. Here in the UK, we have a major retailer grocer called Tesco's. Tesco's were fantastic at the process of selling fruit, vegetables, and dry goods to people. And they were so good at it, they generated a huge amount of money. And when their asset became cash, they also went into banking and insurance. That's a radical step forward, right? So it's turning a supermarket into a bank, but they use the asset as a way of pivoting and making that step. So when you're thinking about that more radical disruptive space, try and anchor it into a core competency or an asset that you have to demonstrate the fact that this is a viable option for us. Because often that step into new customers and also new capabilities feels just a bit too adventurous for people. But if you can anchor it with an asset or a competency, it feels a little bit more realistic. Any other questions?
So we have Peter Michel saying we are already using Viva in our company, ORF Austria Public Broadcasting, and we were just complimented today on how good Vima works for all levels of stakeholders. How does it integrate in the larger Hype ecosystem?
All right, so more of a technical question. So what will happen with Vima is it's actually being configured as what we call hype boards. So it's going to be integrated into the platform next year. And so you should be able to operate as a fully integrated platform. So for example, if you needed a single, like say, a globally visible innovation pipeline to show your concept development beyond the initial ideas that you're doing in Vima, you should be able to do that in Hype. So right now, it is a separate module, but in the future, it's going to be fully integrated. So again, talk to your customer success manager or account manager. If you don't know who that is, feel free to contact me and I'll find out who that is for you. And then we can explain to you what that timeline will look like for you.